Why is the EU paying for US debt again? This crisis, just like the crisis in the 1970s, was started by an oversupply of, of money into the US economy through the Federal Reserve System, which uses fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking means that the banks get their interest at 0%, and then they add interest on as they pass the money down through the chain, hence fractional reserve, because they only are required to keep a reserve of cash or gold in their supply in their reserve funds. And now this means that they can leverage out much more money by, for every pound they have or dollar they have, they can lend out 10. And so this led to excessive borrowing, which led to excessive inflation. And this was done to decrease debt over time, because inflation reduces debt's real value. Now, of course, nominal debt actually increased, but can it be argued that this worked? Well, I can argue that it did not, and that inflation is really being hidden within the housing markets in the United States. Now, why is this being paid for by the EU? Why is the EU having to pay for this again? Because the Americans, when you trade with Europe, you don't trade directly with European companies. That goes through a trading bank, and thus there are trade gaps, and this causes inequality. Now, that is because the trading bank takes a cut every time something is traded between two countries or two companies in two different countries. That is why there is a great move towards having multinational companies. Now, at the moment, this might all be solved very equitably, and that Europe again pays, like we did in the 1970s, for America's overconsumption, which they was paid for because Chinese companies, which was lent to the US through the US Treasury bonds market by Chinese companies. So the Americans are effectively paying for Chinese consumer goods which they've imported in, and thus they've also imported Chinese inflation, while the Chinese have exported their inflation out of the country. That is the problem with trade. But because of comparative advantage, you gain by trading anyway. Just because it's better to. So it's better for a competitor to have their goods produced in a competitor's country. So it's better for America to produce low-cost goods in China under a Chinese brand name or whatever, than to produce them in America, where they'd have to pay higher health insurance, higher costs and everything else. Now, why is Europe paying for all this? Well, because Europe is the largest producer of machine tools, and so Americans are producing most of their, and China is producing most of their stuff with European machine tools. But of course, this all has to be paid for, because American production is not necessarily as efficient as European production, and so therefore there is some mechanism going on where Europe is paying for America's debt. Now, I could not put this out into the general sphere as it is quite complicated, but it is to do with these trading banks. There is more being imported into Europe via this, and it has to be paid for through consumption. And so there is also barriers to trade between these two things, because of the NAFTA agreement, which is a common tariff between America, Canada and Mexico, and also the tariff, which is a tax on trade within the EU. Now, this forms a barrier of entry which gives some protection for the EU and the NAFTA countries, from each other's inflation, but it is not free trade. Now, I would like free trade between America and Europe, but the problem is the importation of inflation. Now, America, I believe, is through some mechanism we are importing America's inflation, and that is what's caused the crisis over here. Now, that's because European companies took on American debt, believing that the bubble could be controlled, but because the Federal Reserve pushed so much money into the system, it could not, and this snapped back the economy from an inflationary spiral into a deflationary spiral, because there was too much money chasing too few goods and services. Okay, right. So that solves the problem of how Europe is paying for American debt. The question is why? Why are we paying for American debt when Europe has unsupported debt, that is debt that cannot be paid for without a rise in taxation of only 6%, and America's unsupported debt, it's between 6 and 12%. For most countries, Greece is an exception with perhaps 27% unsupported debt, so they have had to raise taxes. But America's unsupported debt is 155%, and yet no one is talking about a run on the dollar. Why is that? Why is everybody talking about runs on the euro and runs on the pound? This is not correct. This is not right. Also, the government in Britain is cutting back on services which are vital for the recovery. Now, there is cuts in Germany, but they are not severe. They are not 20% cuts on defence and education as they are in Britain. We are cutting in Europe. They are cutting sensibly, and everything is audited. Every bit of spending and every bit of taxation is audited through the European Commission, the Europe Civil Service. This is not happening in Great Britain. Also, this has not happened in America. There must be some oversight over the central banks, and the central banks have also made instruments where they're trading on the possible devaluation of stock, which has not yet been devaluated. It's a put on deflation and inflation on stocks. Now, this might actually be something that could be very corrosive to the capital markets. That's the markets for machine tools and goods such as that. Now, that is very wrong, right? But that has not been something that's been widely put out into the public sphere, that speculators are doing this. This has to be stopped. All right. Keep checking out my economics vids as well as my South Africa vids and my vids on general current events. Thank you. Peace.